Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. So, since this is my first video, I thought I would start the channel off with a banger. And for that, I decided to talk about a video called Charlie Kirk Exposes the Big Switch Myth on Turning Point USA's YouTube channel. Now, if you haven't heard of Turning Point USA, they're essentially a movement of mostly millennial and Gen Z conservatives fighting against socialism and political correctness and the dreaded SJWs or whatever. And this guy is their leader, Charlie Kirk. Charlie and his movement as a whole is known for speaking at a lot of different places, and particularly on college campuses, where he talks about how the evil SJWs control college campuses and oppress conservative students with their political correctness or something, despite having never attended a university himself. This video appears to be recorded from some sort of speaking engagement like this. So, for context on what his video is about, the Big Switch, or Party Switch as it is more commonly known, refers to the idea that the Republicans and Democrats switched voter bases both demographically and ideologically at some point since the time of the Civil War. When you look at the facts, this makes sense. After all, Black people have switched from overwhelmingly Republican to overwhelmingly Democrat. White Southerners have switched from overwhelmingly Democrat to overwhelmingly Republican, etc. Democrats originally catered to Southern and Western farmers, grangers, and other varieties of populists, whereas Republicans originally represented the people who were educated, wealthy country club goers from New York and Boston. You know, the same people who modern Republican populists like Trump and Alex Jones would deride as the elites. The Democrats back then would have been seen as the more traditionalist or reactionary party, while the Republicans fill that role today. Now, you may be thinking, what's so controversial about that? Well, as it happens, one of the big factors connected to this is race, as in those conservative Southern Democrats, as well as many other Democrats from before the switch, were rather racist, supporting slavery and segregation and such, which is why black people tended to vote Republican. And the switch was heavily impacted by the civil rights movement, and in that case would mean all of those racists switched over to the Republican Party. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Republicans today are automatically racist or that Republicans today are responsible for the racism of the past. But many Republicans do not feel comfortable with the idea that their party has more of these racists in their voter base. This is why Charlie Kirk, a conservative Republican, feels the need to debunk this switch. Now, before I give my critique, I would like you all to watch the original video so that you can see I'm not misrepresenting it. If you want to learn more about the party switch, I will also link 2 more videos about the topic, one by Knowing Better and one by Polydice. All links will be in the description. Now let's dive right in.
What the general consensus that is taught in schools, correct me if I'm wrong, it's that Republicans were really the Democrats back then.
Well, that's one way of saying it. The idea is that people who are Republicans now more likely would have been Democrats back then. I get this phrasing is mostly metaphorical, but let's continue and see where this goes.
Abe Lincoln was actually a Democrat. In fact, I unearthed a plaque at University of Illinois Chicago that still stands to this day that says Abraham Lincoln Democrat, and they refused to take it down. Still to this day. It's stunning.
No, Lincoln was not a Democrat, obviously. Charlie is right there, and that plaque is wrong about that. Alternatively, you could interpret the plaque to say that ideologically he was a Democrat, as in someone who supported democracy in a way that was not necessarily related to the Democratic Party. But even then, the plaque would be misleading. There is no general consensus, including in schools, saying Lincoln was a Democrat. I grew up going to a public school in a mostly progressive neighborhood, and our teachers, who were also mostly liberal, taught us that Lincoln was a Republican. Pretty much everyone I've ever talked to knows that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. This isn't some widespread issue. On top of that, proponents of the party switch theory, the people Charlie Kirk is arguing against, recognize Lincoln as a Republican. Their theory is that despite the fact that they were Republicans at the time, Lincoln and his supporters would be more likely to be Democrats today. So this plaque Charlie brought up doesn't really relate to the argument at hand.
So they say that essentially the Republicans used to be the Democrats, and the Democrats used to be the Republicans.
Again, metaphorically. Obviously, Republicans were Republicans and Democrats were Democrats in a literal sense. But the party switch theory states that, since then, many defining attributes of both parties, including voter base and ideology with regards to social views, have switched. Since I've explained this before, I don't think I need to again. So just watch what Charlie does with this metaphorical, figurative speech.
So what are they really saying? Well, that Republicans have always been racist and they're still racist today. That's essentially what they're saying. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Exactly, Charlie. Nothing could be further from the truth, because that's not what they're saying. The idea of the party switch is not that the Republicans were always racist. In fact, the entire party switch idea is that the Republicans weren't racist back then, but are now, and whatever. I've explained this already, you get the point. The point I'm trying to make here is that Charlie, who is trying to make the argument that the party switch never happened, has used a bunch of tangled up metaphorical language to completely misdefine the premise of the party switch. Talk about a straw man fallacy. Anyway, this means one of two possibilities. The first of two possibilities is that he did not realize he was committing such a fallacy, which would mean that he was either A, totally ignorant about what the party switch actually refers to, or B, actually is informed about the idea of the party switch, yet is so lacking in self awareness that he is totally unaware that he has completely reversed the position of the very argument he was refuting in a way that was glaringly obvious. Either of which means he is completely unqualified to be talking about the party switch. The other possibility is that he is aware of the fallacy he is making, in which case he is either being deliberately manipulative towards the crowd by completely twisting the argument, or he is just being lazy and didn't feel the need to waste time constructing an actual argument about the party switch, despite it being, his job to do so as a speaker who is talking about it, and is instead substituting said argument for a giant fallacy.
The Republican Party was founded upon the election of Abraham Lincoln.
The Republican Party was founded in 1854. Lincoln was elected in 1860 and inaugurated in April 1861. So no, the party wasn't founded with the election of Lincoln. Also, if the party was founded upon Lincoln's election, he wouldn't have been part of it. In fact, Lincoln wasn't even the first Republican presidential candidate. That was John C. Fremont, who ran in 1856. Now, obviously, this wasn't the point that Charlie is trying to make here. The point he was trying to make was that the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, which ended slavery in the U.S. However, as previously established, this does not refute the idea that the party switched later on at some point during the past 150 years. In fact, proponents of the party switch theory recognize that Lincoln was a Republican, and that the Republicans were the party that ended slavery. The only thing this does refute is Charlie's straw man argument that Republicans were always racist. No proponent of the theory is arguing that.
The Republican Party has always been the party of human freedom, of human rights, and liberation from bondage. Has always been that party, and will always be that party.
Well, yes, it was that party, but in order to prove it is still that party, you need to provide some examples of today. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. Also, the idea that the Republican Party will always be the good guy with the same ideology forever seems incredibly naive. How do you know that there will never be some events in the future causing their parties to even slightly shift their beliefs enough over time to the point where the parties kind of start to change again? Pretty much every political scientist agrees that political realignment is a thing, even if they don't entirely agree with the typical idea of the party switch. We even see shifting among parties today. Traditional conservatives in the Republican Party were incredibly opposed to Trump before he won the nomination and later the presidency. I've also seen the right accuse Democrats of shifting values over time, such as switching from agreeing with Republicans and wanting to secure our borders to instead wanting open borders. Conservative YouTube channel PragerU did an entire video claiming that Democrats have changed from liberal to leftist. That same channel also put out a video claiming John F. Kennedy would have been a Republican today. So, even according to conservatives, political parties can change over time. Charlie's blind loyalty to his own party and denial of the very possibility of political realignment is either incredibly naive or is just some shitty talking point that even he must know deep down is bullshit.
Now, the Democrats founded the KKK, sent KK members to Congress, put KK members as governor, so on and so forth.
Again, all this does is refute the straw man Charlie created earlier on in this video. It does nothing to refute the actual argument that Democrats have changed. The KKK was originally comprised of all or mostly Democrats, but look at who the KKK is supporting today. Need I remind you that David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the KKK, now identifies as a Republican and endorsed Trump in the previous election. The KKK is not voting alongside those libtard SJWs who support affirmative action for black people and Black Lives Matter. And how about the alt-right, another similar but more modern white supremacist movement? They're not voting for Democrats, they are overwhelmingly voting Republican. Because while it is true that not all of their views align with the views of standard conservatives, they recognize that it is the side most similar to their own beliefs. And then there's the Confederacy, which was founded by Southern Democrats following the election of Lincoln with the intention of preserving the institution of slavery, and it was opposed by Northerners, and most strongly by Lincoln and the other Northern Republicans. Who is waving the Confederate flag and supporting Confederate monuments and statues today? I'll give you a hint. It's not those libtard SJW Democrats who are triggered by the Confederate flag and want to destroy our history by tearing down those statues. Wow, we're not even a minute into Charlie's video and everything he's said so far is utter shit.
But the consensus that is taught in our schools is that somehow there was this great switch, that all of a sudden there was like a handshake done in Congress, and they just like switched ideological parties. Completely and totally untrue.
You're right. It is completely untrue because that's not how it happened. They never shook hands in Congress and called it a deal. Of course, Charlie is saying this as a metaphor, but it's also a gross oversimplification, and we all know how Charlie likes to use metaphors to manipulate the entire course of the argument in a way that is totally dishonest. Also, no one is saying it was all of a sudden. It happened in multiple shifts. Around the time you get to Franklin Roosevelt, there were social liberals and social conservatives in both parties, as in both parties had a more racist and a less racist faction. Truman, for example, was a Democrat, and he desegregated the armed forces. Hubert Humphrey at the 1948 Democratic National Convention gave a speech supporting civil rights. It's important to note that a lot of this social division between parties was heavily based on geography, with the North being more liberal and the South being more conservative as a general rule. And since the South had historically been used to voting Democrat, you continued to have a large faction of Southern conservatives in the Democratic Party. Then Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson, former vice president to popular Democratic President John F. Kennedy, became president following Kennedy's assassination and passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, causing most of the Southern conservatives to gradually distance themselves from the Democratic Party, influencing Nixon to use his Southern strategy to bring Southern conservatives into his party by making the Republican Party the more socially conservative party. Of course, prior to making the switch to the Republican Party, many Southern conservative Democrats rebelled from the main party. In 1948, conservative Southern Democrats formed the States' Rights Democratic Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, and ran their own candidate, Strom Thurmond, who later became a Republican. In 1968, former Democrat and Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, a staunch segregationist, split off from the Democrats and ran for the far-right American Independent Party.
And toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Yeah, that was him. But anyway, I don't know what things were like at Charlie's school. But at my school, it wasn't just taught that the parties just magically switched. My teachers just taught us the history, and through logic, most of us came to the conclusion that the parties switched. My teachers just showed us the history. They didn't tell us what to think about it.
So how do I prove that? Let's talk about it logically first and foremost. Why is it that as the South got significantly less racist over time, it got more Republican? How's that possible? It should have been the opposite. It should have been that if the South got less racist, it should have gotten more Democrat, correct?
Okay, so let's say you have a super racist uncle who every Thanksgiving for the past several years has consistently made super racist statements at the dinner table. Now let's say that one year he's dialed it back and doesn't make as many overtly racist statements as he previously used to, and appears to have become less racist. Does that mean he is now less racist than you? No, of course not, and it's the same thing here. Just because Southerners have become less overtly racist doesn't mean that they have become less racist than everyone else. As long as they are still more racist, relatively, the party switch theory holds, so this argument doesn't really debunk everything. And when you consider the fact that a 2011 poll has shown that 46% of Mississippi Republicans still oppose interracial marriage, this isn't looking so good for Charlie.
How is it that South Carolina, that has been commonly labeled as the most racist state in the country, elected an Indian American daughter, first-generation immigrant as governor, and an openly a black senator? How is that possible with 67% of the vote?
Do people really still consider South Carolina to be the most racist state these days anyway? I'm pretty sure the most stereotypically racist states today, according to most people, are Mississippi and Alabama, the former of which has the Confederate flag in their state flag. Although, if we do want to talk about South Carolina, they did have the Confederate flag above their capital until 2015, so progress hasn't exactly been super fast down there either. All three of those states, by the way, are in the South, which, according to Charlie Kirk, got significantly less racist, but anyway, I digress. In all seriousness, the fact that there are some non-white Republicans today doesn't prove that Republicans are less racist than Democrats. Using that metric, the Democrats have the Republicans beat by a long shot. Democrats tend to have far more candidates and elected officials of color than Republicans. I would like to therefore turn this question back on Charlie. If the parties never switch and the Democrats are the real racists, why have they elected a black president as well as countless other representatives of color? Just something for you to ponder.
Well, it's because if you look at the trend within the Democrat Party, is they used to control the bodies of African Americans, now they control them politically.
What even is Charlie saying? They controlled black people physically as slaves and now they control them politically? And that's supposed to be the big equivalence linking modern Democrats to their dark slave-owning past? Are black people chained up somewhere at some secret polling station in the basement of an old plantation where they're being forced to vote Democrat? Is that why 90% of black people today vote Democrat? Or are they all just being mind-controlled like zombies or something? Please, Charlie, explain.
And look no further than when this this change happened with Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, LBJ was a bitter and committed racist. He hated black people.
No. He wasn't a bitter, committed racist. There's no proof of that. He was actually one of the few Southern Democrats who was socially liberal. Now, let's say that, hypothetically, he was initially a racist and then changed. After all, people change ideologies all the time. When I was younger, I used to be conservative, and now I'm a liberal. So, suppose he changed too. Good for him. He came around and supported civil rights. I hardly see what's the problem with that.
He, in fact, opposed the Civil Rights Act for 20 years. He did not want to sign it.
The Civil Rights Act was initially called for by Kennedy in 1963, and Johnson signed it in 1964. How could LBJ be opposed to a bill for 20 years if that bill was only on the table for about a year? Either Charlie Kirk is just being lazy with his research and is just repeating things he heard other people say, or is straight up lying.
It was JFK that actually championed the Civil Rights Act. He was slaughtered in the streets of Dallas.
Yes, JFK the Democrat. I don't think I need to explain this one too much. It just shows how much Charlie is cherry-picking his Democrats here in order to prove the point that Democrats are racist.
And LBJ said, boy, I hope I don't have to get those N-word people the right to vote.
Except he never said that, and there's no real evidence to suggest he did. Citation needed there.
Because they were all Republicans in the South.
The majority of black Americans have been voting Democrat since FDR. Unfortunately, I could not find specific statistics saying the breakdown of specifically Southern black voters for this time period, but in that case, I would like to ask Charlie Kirk to please present me with whatever statistics he did use to arrive at his own conclusion that all of these Southern black people broke with the trends of black voters across the nation at the time. Since it's already clear from previous points that Charlie Kirk never did any research or was just lying, I doubt he actually has anything to support his claim.
So LBJ was tasked. He was tasked with a problem. He saw Martin Luther King, who was a Republican, by the way.
You mean the Democratic Socialist Martin Luther King Jr., who endorsed LBJ in the 1964 election? Yeah, a real conservative Republican you got there. Definitely would be wearing a MAGA hat and attending Trump rallies today.
Marching the streets of Alabama, marching the streets of Mississippi, and gaining a lot of traction. So Lyndon Baines Johnson said, I got a problem here. The Civil Rights Act's probably going to pass.
Except it wasn't a given that it was going to pass. Southern conservatives, most of which were Southern Democrats, filibustered the bill for a long time, and it was LBJ who worked tirelessly to unite a bipartisan coalition of liberal and mostly Northern Republicans and Democrats to break the filibuster. LBJ could have just done nothing and the bill would not pass. I highly recommend you go check out the film All the Way, which tells the story of how LBJ fought incredibly hard to pass the Civil Rights Act. Again, Charlie Kirk is pretty much just making shit up and ignoring the actual series of events that took place in order to suit his agenda.
So what do? I make a grand bargain. My hatred for black people remains the same, but they'll probably get the right to vote. I know what I'll do. I'll control them.
Control them? Interesting. How so? Please explain.
I'll get them committed to the welfare state.
Black people have been voting for social welfare policies since FDR. Maybe it has less to do with wanting to be controlled by welfare and more with the fact that they have historically been poor due to, well, racism, and therefore need more assistance in the first place. But according to Charlie, helping people in need is the same exact thing as controlling them. Tell me, Charlie, do you ever give to charity? And if the answer is yes, why do you feel the need to control other people like that, you bigot?
I'll cluster them geographically.
Cluster them geographically? Because it's not like there had already been a system in place since the end of slavery keeping black people separated from white people that pre-exists any sorts of policies by LBJ. Oh, wait, segregation. But seriously, can you please explain what policies LBJ enacted to further segregate black people? Please, enlighten me.
Will deteriorate their family.
Are there any actual examples of Democrats deliberately deteriorating the black family? Or is this just a poor attempt to connect hollow, meaningless conservative talking points like family values to this whole debate?
Will introduce drugs into the inner cities.
Yes, because we all know about the Stoner Act of 1965 and the Accessible Cocaine Act of 1966, written and signed by LBJ as part of his series of laws legalizing drugs in inner cities. Oh wait, that never happened.
Not police them.
And we all know how good police are for black people. It's not as if there are riots every year due to unarmed and non-violent black civilians being shot by police or something, but yeah, apparently the best way to control people is by not using police to control them. Sound logic there, Charlie. You really are one of the greatest conservative intellectuals of our era. Although, I think it's also worth pointing out how much this logic resembles the so-called humane excuses for slavery. The idea that black people can't do well on their own and are better off if they are being controlled by higher institutions.
Subsidize single motherhood.
Those evil bastard Democrats.
They're really crossing the line there. How dare they financially support women who have been left by their husbands and can't afford to feed both themselves and a child? Those controlling tyrants.
And I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 100 years. Direct quote in the presidential record.
That quote comes from a 1993 interview with an Air Force One flight attendant who thought he overheard LBJ say it nearly 30 years prior. It seems interesting that Republicans will harass and threaten a bunch of women testifying that they had been sexually assaulted, and then put the man they accuse on the Supreme Court without much of a trial. Yet they will take the word of one guy claiming he thinks he heard someone say something racist on a plane 30 years ago, like it's part of the Bible. In reality, there is no real evidence of LBJ saying that quote. You know what is a real quote, though? In a 1981 interview, Republican strategist Lee Atwater is well documented to have said the following. You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, then we are doing away with the racial problem one way or another. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut this, is more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. I think this quote is pretty self-explanatory, so I don't need to get too much into it. But let's go back for a sec and say that LBJ did actually say that. My question would be, so what? Does that change the fact that his presidency was good for the African American population of this country? Does that change the fact that black people may like democratic policies and that those policies may even be beneficial to them? Should all progressive democratic leaders today be discredited for their work because of this? Should all black voters abandon the party that best represents their views and interests today because some leader in the party over 50 years ago said something racist on an airplane? Seems like a bit of a stretch. In order for this to really delegitimize the current Democratic Party, all of these other Democrats today would have to be in on this evil conspiracy to trick black people for 200 years. It's also just a dumb strategy to do all of that just to get the quote-unquote N-words voting Democrat for 200 years. Black voters have been voting Democrat since the New Deal, and the Civil Rights Act pushed away the white Southerners, which had been a core component of the Democratic voter base for 100 years. This argument also makes a grand assumption, and for that I would like to bring it back to the main point of his argument.
Well, it's because if you look at the trend within the Democrat Party, is they used to control the bodies of African Americans, now they control them politically.
He assumes that somehow black people have been controlled for 50 years and have just been completely complacent in their own oppression. Charlie Kirk's primary argument against the party switch not happening is not about policy, but about some bullshit claim that black people choosing to vote Democrat is at all comparable to them being owned as slaves. If all of those democratic policies Charlie listed are so harmful, then why do they vote for them? Is it that 90% of them happen to be brainwashed and are incapable of thinking for themselves? A common talking point used by conservatives such as Charlie is that liberals are so intolerant because they don't believe in diversity of thought. Yet here Charlie, who is supposed to be Mr. Diversity of Thought, is calling 90% of an entire minority group a bunch of mind slaves because he cannot imagine for a second that free-thinking individuals, especially a historically persecuted minority whose persecution has been so formational in the political history of this country, happen to disagree with him. If you disagree with him, and especially if you are black, you're just some zombie mind slave to him. In conclusion, what do we learn from today? Charlie Kirk is either a complete idiot with no self-awareness who has no idea what he is talking about, A manipulative, lying hack trying to twist the argument and even make shit up in order to fool people, or is just incredibly lazy with how he researches and constructs an argument, or perhaps he's some sort of combination of the three. We also learn that Charlie Kirk cannot for a moment conceive that a free-thinking person would have a completely different ideology from him, and we learn that he pretty much sees 90% of all black people as zombie mind slaves. Now, here's the thing. Are all Republicans a bunch of racists trying to assert dominance over minorities running around in Klan robes? Obviously not, because both parties consist of a diverse coalition, and obviously I think it's wrong to blame either party as a whole for past atrocities that most people today have no part in. However, if we are going to talk about the history of political parties to see how it impacts politics today, we need to be honest about it, unlike Charlie Kirk. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell to receive notifications, and please let me know in the comments what you would like me to review next.